Ready.
Question number 1. What country is family from? My father from Sweden, my mother, United States. What year were you born? 1914. Where did you grow up? In the rural area in Bray Township, Pennington County, on a farm. When did you get married? June 23, 1935. Where did you work? College. College? Started out as a housekeeper where needed, then a course in cosmetology. After that, I worked in Pembina and Drayton, North Dakota, Hallock and Thief River Falls as a hairdresser, also as a clerk in store for some time. What did your family do for a job? They farmed. How many brothers and sisters do you have? Living, I have 2 sisters and 2 brothers. Dead are 3 brothers. How many children do you have? 2 living, a son died at 8 months. How many grandchildren do you have? 5 living, a grandson died at 17 years of cancer. Do you remember any special family traditions? What was your mother and father's names? John Henry Lindbloom, Agnes Leonai Rooks. How many wars have you lived through this far in your life? 5. Are you tired of this yet? No, but concerned about doing justice to you. I had 7 brothers and sisters, 1 full sister and 2 half-brothers. My 2 half-brothers and 1 full brother are deceased, all 3 in their 50s. The above sentence is as clear as mud, right? This is what I meant to say. In Mother's first marriage, we were 5, 2 girls, 3 boys. In second marriage, 2 boys and 1 girl. That which is underlined in red is correct. Sorry, dear one. Do you remember World War I? Were any family members sent overseas? Do you remember what your family did during the war? What did you do? No, I do not remember World War I. Where did your family live during World War I? Where did they work? We lived on our farm and were farmers, farming our own land. How did World War I affect you and your family? I was too young to remember. The next question's answer is all I can recall of conversations regarding it. Did any of your family members or close friends die in this war? I can remember my parents speaking of 2 good friends who had been killed in World War I, namely Guy Hansen and Casper Crown. What was it like? Was it scary? Do you have any memories of it, good or bad? In later years, my mother married Reuben Rooks, who had been in World War I. He didn't care to talk of it except when he gave support or a donation to the Salvation Army. He said the Salvation Army was at the front with the wounded, giving supplies and care. The Red Cross sold supplies. Do you remember World War II? Were any family members sent overseas? Do you remember what your family did during the war? What did you do? Yes, I remember. My husband's brother Vernon Mosbeck was killed in Italy. My brother John Lindbloom was in the Merchant Marines. My mother was widowed and working at various jobs, nursing home and poultry plant, to support my 2 half-brothers and 1 half-sister. My father and later stepfather were both deceased. My older brothers and sister were married. I was married and we were farming our farm and renting another. Where did your family live during the war? Where did they work? During the war, 1 brother farmed in Sanders Township, the other in Bray Township, both in Pennington County. My sister was married, living in Thief River Falls. Her husband worked for a gas and oil company trucking. My mother and my younger brothers and sisters lived in a farmhouse in Bray Township. My husband and I lived in Polk Center Township, Pennington County, and were farming. Much emphasis was placed on farm production. How did World War II affect you and your family? We were alert as to how many of our family and friends will be called into active service. Most of all was concern and anxiety for those serving and their families. World War II affected most families by a member or more being in danger. Did any of your family members of close friends die in this war? Yes, my husband's brother was killed in Italy. He was in the Signal Corps and was killed by a sniper. He was Vernon Mosbeck. From our immediate neighborhood, 2 brothers, Steve and John Jagle, were killed. What was it like? Was it scary? Yes, it was scary. Family said to try to be prepared to receive a letter, telephone call, or a person in authority coming and informing them their loved one had been killed in action. In many cases, the information was missing in action, then later the death notice. Do you have any memories of it, good or bad? The good was when the war was over. It was good when we received mail from our brothers. At least when they wrote it, they were alive and well. All mail was censored. My brother-in-law and his wife had a code that each could understand what they couldn't openly relate. The last letter received had the statement in it, "The rose is in full bloom." He was saying, the fighting is in full force. We believe it possible, he being in the Signal Corps, going into it first was the more risky, but someone had to do it. My brother John Lindbloom served in the Coast Guard when he entered in 1941. Later he served in the Merchant Marines during the war. The merchant ships brought oil and products necessary for the fighting forces. The ship John served on was wrecked by a torpedo by the Germans. Survivors, he was one of them, were picked up by a destroyer Navy escort. In New Guinea, he was wounded by shrapnel in one leg. John returned home in 1945. Though all mail was censored, we could write and receive mail from our servicemen. I have the last letter received from my husband's brother Vernon. The letters we received were reduced in size but very legible. We were kept informed to a certain extent by radio and newspaper. We received books. We received books with stamps for sugar rationing. Coffee, butter, gasoline, and tires were rationed. Lumber and steel were hard to get. Women's silk stockings were hard to get. Cars were also hard to get.
See, what did we talk about? What was
You were talking about Swedish, what?
Oh yeah, the homestead thing with Grandpa's the land there that was homesteaded. That how much did they give? How much land did they give you when they came over?
I don't know. I don't know what the exact acreage is. You know, to this day I don't know how much land Grandpa owned. But let's see. Yes, I should know because Dad had gotten a quarter. Oh, I think it was about 3/4.
3/4 of a section.
Well, it would be 3/4 of land and a quarter. No, it wouldn't be that much. I think a quarter is 160 acres, I believe. I think that was considered a quarter of land.
Yeah. It's...
And let's see, there was down by the schoolhouse and by that granary and then at home. Oh boy, I just don't dare to say because I'd maybe be off on that.
How did they clear the trees, like when they came, the land?
By hand. By hand. An axe and good old hand labor. There was no other way to do it.
How would they get the stumps out?
Well, I'm assuming that they what I had seen Dad do was just put some chains or rope or something around the stumps and pull those that they could, and the others they just had to leave and farm around. The same thing with big stones and rocks. They just had to farm around them. There just was nothing else to do. There weren't rock pickers like there are now. When I think of how much easier farming and clearing land and everything is today.
With the mechanization.
Yes. Now, I didn't mention about the hay baler and the combine on that either. I forgot that. Well, anyway.
The team of horses.
Yeah,
Did they play a part in,
the horses. Well, I would imagine they would. I don't want to say too much about the land clearing because I can't remember any of that being done when I was a kid growing up. I just can't. And the latter years, they've got all this equipment for clearing. But the horses that was the main source of, should I say, farming? Because it was the horses that did all the work, which tractors do today. And Grandpa Lindbloom was known for having several horses and nice horses and well taken care of.
The four that, you remember the name?
He had 8 more of the time than he had 4. The last years he just had 4. But they would, many times they would change horses at noon. And then we let them rest, those rest, and then take out fresh ones.
A team of 4, so then they had 8 to begin with?
Then they would have that many. But now, when we were farming, Rick had horses, and he had a couple of, when we moved out there, they had 1 mule. And then the road was on the south side of the house. Now it's where it should be, on what the so-called line right north of the house. But at the time we moved there, it was on the south side of the house. And that old mule, his name was Roy. And the fence, the fence for the animals run just real close to the road, and I'd walk down for the mail. And that mule would be running alongside of the fence where I was walking. I would get so angry at that mule. There wasn't a thing you could do. There's nothing as stubborn as a mule. I never did succeed in breaking him. Every time I went for the mailbox, I could depend on that. I can't remember what Rick did with that mule. I can't remember, but he sure was a stubborn old thing. And
but it was used in the field then too?
Yeah. Yeah.
Did they plow them? Mules?
I imagine they did. See, at the time, they had used it earlier, but at the time we moved out there in 38, Rick was using horses, but I don't know how come that mule came, how come he took it over to the place, if the folks didn't have a fence for it or not. I don't know why it was there.
Grandpa Henry was still at the other place down the Tower Road, right? That's where the homestead was. Well, now when I'm talking about this goat and that, I'm talking about Rick and I farming. The mule, yeah.
But you see, my dad died before Rick and I were married.
Oh, okay.
Oh, yes.
You said 1930...
Yeah, Dad died in 32 and we were married in 35.
Oh, okay. George, or Dad mentioned that they'd sneak behind the barn, and I don't know if they had moonshine. Did Grandpa ever have a still? Or
Oh, no. Not ever.
You ever hear about that?
No, I know Grandpa didn't. He liked his liquor.
Yeah.
Yeah, he did, and my dad did too, but they didn't sniff on it all the time like people do these days.
Yeah.
And I'm not excusing it, not by any means, but they'd go what they called on a spree.
Yeah.
And how often, I don't know. If it was once, I can't remember, because I was just a kid.
Sure.
I can't remember if it was once a month or about once every 6 weeks or maybe once every 2 months, but I have one picture in my memory of, I can't remember which one of the kids was a baby. And that baby was in the buggy. It was either Harold or Ellen. And I was walking alongside of the buggy with Mother, and she had done the milking. She'd done the evening chores, and she was walking down the driveway. And I was walking alongside of her. And I remember the thought coming to me, someday I'll be big, and then I'll be doing the same thing. See, Mother wasn't saying anything against them. She wasn't acting angry, but she was walking down the road. Well, then eventually Grandpa, I don't know if they'd be gone a day and a night or 2 days. It wasn't any longer. And then my dad would sleep in the barn for a couple of nights, because he said that's the place for pigs to sleep.
And you felt guilty.
But the last years he never did that.
Yeah.
This was when I was real young, and well, this was when Grandpa was still pretty active, Grandpa Lindbloom. And there were others that did the same thing. There was one neighbor, I don't want to mention names, but there was one neighbor where the woman ruled the roost, and you see, my Grandma Lindbloom, Peter Lindbloom's wife, my grandmother, my dad's mother, she died before Mother and Dad were married. So I never knew her. But this woman of this neighbor, she had it so in for Grandpa because he drank, once in a while. And her husband just loved the stuff. Ooh, he just loved it. And Grandpa would swing by that way, and if this other guy was outside, he'd see to that he got all he wanted.
Oh, sure.
And then the wife would really be mad at Grandpa,
Instigator.
Yeah. Grandpa was rather humorous, too, because one time somebody was raking him up and down for his drinking, when he'd drink once in a while. Now, remember, he did not do it all the time. And somebody was raking him up and down, and he said, well, if you get drunk, that goes over. But if you're stupid and foolish, that never goes over. Take it as you want it, if the shoe fits, whatever.
Yeah.
But I'm certainly not excusing my dad's or my granddad's drinking, but I do say that there's nobody that doesn't have something good about them, and they both had a lot of good about them. For instance, I'm sorry to say, but our church at one time, Black River Lutheran, were pretty narrow-minded. They were called themselves Christian, but I don't know. Sometimes there were little things that let slip, but I guess the same thing is true today, and it's the same thing is true of myself too, I imagine, and everybody else. But when my granddad died, there was I don't know if it was a rule or an ordinance, I don't know what you'd call it, but out at Black River, if you weren't a member of the church, you couldn't be buried on the west side. You had to be buried north of the church. So there's a row of graves there of people who lived in the neighborhood but weren't necessarily members of the church. And when Grandpa died, they weren't going to bring him into the church because some of them, holier than thou, said that he drank. He couldn't be brought into the church. Whereas some of these others drank too, but they did it on a sly. And what my dad and granddad did, they did it in the open. Well, anyway, Hegstrom, A.P. Hegstrom was the family that raised Lulu Larson, Mosbeck, Carl's wife, my dear sister-in-law. Well, anyway, he was on the church council when they were discussing that Pete Lindbloom couldn't be brought into church. And Hegstrom spoke up, and he'd been on the council for years. He was a highly respected man, much thought of, both him and his wife. And Hegstrom spoke up and he said, well, okay, if that's the way you feel. But he said, we never came around asking for money for the church that Peter Lindbloom didn't donate, and donate generously. And especially generously when we were buying the bill. He said, if that's the way you feel, he said, you take my name off the church board. I don't want to serve on the council. Needless to say, Grandpa's body was brought into church. And the church didn't fall down. But anyway, there was some interesting episodes.
That's neat.
Yeah.
Back to the old home place, because I've been on it, and I just have memories of the foundation.
Yeah.
And Grace, or Mom, you don't like me calling her Grace.
No, I don't. I don't like kids calling their parents by their gay Christian names, but I'm sorry, but it's just, I'm from the old school.
Yeah, I understand.
I think it's more respectful the other way.
Yeah. Well, I don't think I ever call her Grace to her face.
No.
It's always Mom. She talked about a time that Grandpa, as a punishment, would drop stones on the kids' feet, on George's feet. And I don't know if you recall that or not.
That is, I absolutely can remember nothing of that at all.
Okay.
Was that my dad or my granddad, supposedly?
I think she spoke of Henry, but
That'd be my dad. I just absolutely cannot believe that. I just absolutely cannot believe that of my dad.
yeah, George never mentioned that. Mom talked about it, and I don't remember.
I sure wished I'd have heard that before so I could have asked Mother about that while she was living, because I have, and it seems to me that I would have had some recollection of George crying or, I cannot, just cannot believe that. The only reprimanding my dad would do, and that wasn't good, when he'd get after the boys for fighting or get after any of us, he'd take his mittens off and slap us across the head with it.
Oh.
Which that wasn't good.
Yeah.
But he'd do that, but that was very seldom. And I remember one time that I really got a spanking from him, and he come and talked to me about it afterwards, and the big tall man, 6 feet tall, the tears was running down his cheeks. We had a hired man, I won't say his name, he wasn't from our immediate neighborhood, and I was very, very young. I don't know how old I could have been, but I had never heard swear words. And he taught me swear words. And I didn't know that they were bad. I had never heard them, but I didn't know that they were any different than anything else. And Mother said something to me, and I answered her with those swear words. And oh, did I get a spanking from my dad. And the hired man knew about it, or I don't know if he's seen it or but he knew about it, and he went and talked to Dad about it. And he felt bad, see?
Explain.
Yeah, he felt bad. And when my dad come and talked to me about it, he talked to me about it in Swedish, and the tears was rolling down his cheeks.
I'll be there.
Because I had been unduly punished. Well, maybe, I don't know. I didn't know it was bad. That's all. It was just another part of the language as far as I was concerned, but I hadn't heard it before, so, anything you hadn't heard before, it sounded kind of good. You know what I mean?
Sure, if a young child would know.
But, anyway.
On the farm, what you mentioned, chickens, what other animals besides the horses and the chickens?
That we had at home when I was growing up, or when Rick was, and I farmed?
When you were growing up.
When I was growing up, we had pigs, and chickens, and cattle, and the horses. That's all I can remember. We never had sheep at home. Rick and I did, but my first contact with sheep was after we moved out on the farm. And the chickens we had at home when I was growing up weren't as a money-making thing. It was, they weren't specially housed and specially fed. And they were more for us using the eggs for baking and eating, and although I'm sure there were eggs sold when there were enough to sell, but the chickens didn't have a special place to be, they just ran in the barn.
What, I know, for using for your own food, did you have a garden?
Oh yes, always a garden.
What types of things did you plant?
Well, potatoes and corn and peas and radishes. I can't remember lettuce so much. Cucumbers. Now this was when I was growing up. When I was growing up. When I had the garden after we were married, then lettuce and rutabagas were added to that. Oh yeah, carrots. We had carrots at home too. Yeah. But the folks didn't care about turnips or rutabagas, and I can't remember we ever having lettuce at home. And then the fruits in the woods was like what I related in when Rick and I lived on the farm. It was wild plums and pin cherries and choke cherries and cranberries and June berries.
What did you make, or what did you do with the berries?
We'd can sauce with sugar, can it. And we'd make jams and jellies. The difference in the jam and jelly was with the jam you used all the fruit and mashed it, and sweetened it and cooked it and cooked it and cooked it, because there wasn't such a thing as sure-gel. So you just cooked it a long time and then it thickened. And then jelly the same way. The jelly was just the juice. Yeah.
There was how many kids? 8 kids in your family?
In my family, yeah, there were 5 in the first family, and then when Mother married Reuben, there were the 3.
You're the oldest of the family?
I'm the oldest of the 8.
Both. Who was it?
Well, I was the oldest, and I'm 80. If Brother George would have lived, he'd have been 78. Harold is 76, and Ellen is 74, and Brother Johnny will be 72 now in May. And then Dad died in 32, and Mother got married in 33, and Russell was the oldest in that family, and he was born. Oh, when was Russell born? He was born before we were married. Oh, I suppose he was born maybe, I have to guess at that, in 33. I wished I could remember how old he was when he died. Now, he was in his 50s when he died, and he died about 3 years ago. Yeah, about 3 years ago he died. And he was in his 50s, but I wonder if he wasn't pretty close to 59. George was in his 50s when he died.
Yeah.
And Ralph died in his 50s. And that was...
Russell, Ralph?
Well, yeah, the first one was Russell, and then Ralph, and then Janet. Dolly. Yeah. So Dolly's the only one left of those 3. And we were all born on the old home place.
Even the Rookses? Grandma always lived there until... When did Grandma...
Well, after Reuben died, then she lived down on the... Well, her and Harold lived over on that Wilson place, and then when Harold got married, then Mother had to move out, and she moved... where did Henry live? She moved back to the home place then. Henry Severy was renting it. And she moved back there and cooked for him with the little kids. And then after that, she lived in a little house.
And this is after Reuben died?
Yeah.
How long was she married to Reuben? How many years total then? 3 kids.
She married Reuben in 33, and Dolly, I looked it up the other day, and Dolly was only 3 when Reuben died.
Okay, I haven't talked about 10 seconds. Okay, anytime.
Do you remember the Great Depression? What was it like growing up in the Depression? Do you remember anything different that your family did that other people didn't do? Now, this is question 26. The answer is yes, I surely do. I was growing up at the time of the Depression. I worked for Herbert Saffridge at Thief River Falls, and I worked 7 days a week from 7 or 7:30 in the morning until they closed the store at 10 or 10:30, whichever it was. My wages were $1 a week. I had one evening off from 8 to 10 a week. At the same time, Henry Carpenter, a friend of ours, a very good friend in fact, asked my husband, Rick, if he had some work for him. Rick answered that, yes, I do, Henry, but I absolutely cannot afford to get any help. I just don't have the money. Henry said, well, what could you afford to pay? And Rick laughingly said, oh, I suppose about 15 cents an hour. I'll take it, Henry said. So Henry worked for Rick, for 15 cents an hour during this depression. At the same time, Edgar Naplin, a friend of ours, shocked grain for Alfred Hallstrom for 15 cents an acre. Oats sold for 6 cents a bushel. Number 1 grade wheat sold for 25 cents. C.E. Naplin shipped sheep and cattle. The cattle were old cows, and the returns didn't pay for the shipping cost. Rick shipped a pig at this time. That didn't pay for the shipping costs either. In the fall of 31, I was working in a beauty shop in fact, I'd started a beauty shop up at Pembina, North Dakota. The first $3.50 I had, I mailed to my mother so that she might buy a pair of shoes. A week or two previous to this, when I had been home, Mother was putting cardboard for soles in the bottom of her shoes. She replied in a letter that, I'm sorry, Mamie, which was my pet name, I hope you don't mind, but I had to use the money you sent for flour, and we're so happy that we could have that. I found some cardboard, and it's really good and solid. I'm using that for soles in the bottom of my shoes. These conditions were the same for everyone. The depression was a thing we all simply coped with. My family weren't used to having more than enough to get along. We didn't spend time wanting. We used that time trying to provide what was needed. At this time I had an interesting experience, and what is most interesting to me is that of all the dresses I've had during my lifetime, since things got better anyway, I don't remember any dress like the dress I'm going to tell you about. I had worked for a neighbor lady helping her house clean. When I came to her house, she says, Mabel, we're going to wallpaper. And I said, I can't wallpaper. I've never wallpapered in my life. Well, by the time I left there, I knew how to do it. When I got home, my neighbor lady, Mother's neighbor lady, Hilda Uckerlund, asked me to come and wallpaper for her, which I did. I got $1.50. Oh boy, I bought material for a dress. And I remember that dress to this day. I could tell you exactly where every seam was and how it was made. It was voile, it was flowered, it had to have a short sleeve because of course the material was limited. But that was fine, it was during the summer. So Aunt Annie sewed me this dress. But then of course voile is very sheer, had to have a slip. What did we do for a slip? At that time we got flour for baking our bread in 100-pound sacks, which had a big print on. However, by soaking it in kerosene for a little while, and then scrubbing it with a strong soap on the washboard and boiling it, it came out snow white. That's what we did and used them for dish towels and the like, and slips. Aunt Annie said, this aunt of mine was a very dear aunt who did sewing for me, and she was my godmother as well. She says, I've got one feed sack. And I says, Mother's got one up home. So I dashed up home and got it ready, and Auntie made me a slip, and I had a very nice outfit, a new dress, when Rick came to see me to go out with him in. It was also a sad time during the Depression, because my father died on June 15th, 1932, at the age of 61 years. He had suffered with a hernia for several years, but there was no money for surgery. However, the hernia became so severe that he died of a strangulated hernia. And it was an untimely death, I feel. Now there's criticism about medical assistance. What is better? Question 27. The Roaring Twenties, or so they were called. What do you remember most about them? What music did you listen to? What did you eat? What did you do for enjoyment, and so forth? At that time we had battery-run radios, and they were used with headphones. Of course, we had to limit the use of the battery-run radio because when the battery run down, well, that just wasn't so good. Before that, for entertainment, we had a phonograph that you cranked for the power to turn the disc, on which were 78 RPM records. Some of the popular songs at that time which you wanted to know about were Somewhere in Old Wyoming, Let Me Call You Sweetheart, Girl of My Dreams, Wreck of the 97, polkas, schottisches, waltzes, two-steps. Some of the great entertainers at home and abroad during this time were Glenn Miller, Kate Smith, Artie Shaw, and Tommy Dorsey. During this time, the Charleston came in, the Charleston dance, and it was a fast, maybe a little bit on the order of the jitterbug. Women wore short dresses, and always a hat. You weren't dressed up unless you had a hat on. This was called the flapper age. At this time, the telephones came into use, and in the rural areas, there would be 8 to 9 persons on what was called on the line. So when each one was assigned a different type of ring, and at home, to get our number, to get us, you rang 2 long and 4 short. Well, needless to say, when anyone was called, it rang into all the homes, all the telephones. So there was a lot of rubbernecking done. There were a lot of this and that done. Okay, for an emergency call, you called the operator, or on your line you rang several short rings. That meant there was an emergency. The operator was stationed at St. Hilaire, and that was called Central, and we had to go through her to Central was 1 long ring, and you had to go through her to call on the outside of your line, and those calls usually were to a doctor or a vet. At that time, doctors made house calls, and of course vets naturally came out in the country, as I suppose they still do, for the large animals. And if you couldn't get them at their call, the operator always knew where they were. Helga and Amanda Colland were the 2 operators that had charge of the telephone office for many, many years, and they were a source of information. Our enjoyment was visiting relatives and friends. During the winter time, my aunt and uncle and their 2 children lived south of where we lived, about 6 miles as the crow would fly. And the folks would hitch up the horses to the sleigh, put straw in the bottom. We kids would sit down there and they'd throw a robe over us. And we'd go down there and spend what we could of the day. Our means of conveyance, where it was at all possible, was walking. We just simply would walk. In the winter time, we'd walk across the fields to the Emil Larson place. We kids would play, and when we got tired, we'd lay down by the cook stove, which was a wood stove, always cozy and warm, while the folks played whist. And when they were through, ready to go home, they'd wake us up, and we'd get up and we'd go and we'd walk home, regardless of how cold it was. That was the way it was. No one thought anything of it. Another activity during the winter time besides these playing whist was they'd take turns going from one place to the other, one home to the other, and all the furniture in the living room was shoved against the wall. You didn't have to worry about carpets as those days being rolled up. There weren't any. And Selmer Olson, one of the neighbors, would get out his fiddle and he'd play. If there was an organ, someone would chord the organ. Children and their parents really lived together. There weren't babysitters at that time, so it gave the families a chance of real togetherness, working together, worshiping together, and just simply living together all the time. We lived, the food we ate, well, we lived off the land. We raised what we needed, and we We pretty much, and we got fruit from the woods. Picked it and canned it. And question 28, what did you do for fun? What about nightclubs? Well, for fun, I have already stated the above, which I think would answer that. At home, after dark, we kids would play, when we were through with the work, we'd play tag. And I can't remember the name of the game, but one game we really liked was we'd take a stump of wood and put a tin can on it, and then we'd get a sturdy stick from the woods, and there was some trick to running and hitting the can off and then running hiding. I don't remember the rules right now. There weren't any toys, except the two toys I had was our neighbor living north of us, Melvin Wood, had made a sled for his kids out of stays from a barrel with and then braced. One brace was a seat to sit on, and the other one was across the front end to put a rope around and pull it. Oh, I seen that sled. Oh, how I wanted a sled. I just dreamed of getting a sled, but I'm glad I hadn't asked for it, because it meant so much more when on January 20th, my birthday, they came down with a sled for me. The other toy I had was, when you had bought $5 worth of groceries, if you could eke out 98 cents, there was a beautiful doll. Somehow Mother managed to get that doll for me. You asked about nightclubs, there wasn't such a thing. Question 29, what did you do at night with no TV and sitting at home? Well, question 28 pretty much answers this. As I said, the adult played whist, a card game, and of course we kids better be pretty quiet so they could concentrate. And I told you, yeah, that takes care of that. Question 30, was church a big part of your life? What religion were you? My parents were not churchgoers in the early years. We kids walked to Sunday school and church when the weather was nice, and that was approximately 6-7 miles we cut across. Well, it would be 6 miles anyway. We have always been Lutherans. Did any family member ever go to college? What did they become? Well, this is a continuation of the one where you asked me about a church. Here's a continuation. All of us, the 8 of us, were to Sunday school enough to be confirmed. We attended the confirmation classes. My 3 younger siblings attended regularly. Mother racing the above and going with them, teaching Sunday school and bringing her car full of neighbor children. This was at Black River Lutheran. All 8 of us were confirmed there. Our church, then as now, is the hub of the community. Then, you asked if any of our family members ever went to college. No, there weren't any that went to college. Question 32. When did you first get electricity? Was it in town or out of town? Did you live in town or in the country? When we first got electricity, it was in December of 1948, and that was when we lived on the farm, on our own farm, having moved there in 38. And that is when we got electricity. 33 question. When did your family first get a car and TV? My parents got a car in about 1918. It was a Model T Ford, and the top could be put down. My husband and I got our first TV about 1956. 34. What did you have to do for chores around the house? Did the whole family help? Children worked with the parents. The whole family worked for livelihood. From 5 years and on, my brother George would get up at 5 in the morning. He was aroused by my dad, and he would help with the milking. My job was to help in the house because Mother went out in the field a lot. And from the time I was about 12 years old, I had charge of things pretty much when Mother was in the field, the kids and the cooking and so on. The water was carried in and out after being used. The wood for the stove and the heater, that wood was carried in, and the ashes were carried out. And we had the clean garden. We fed the calves, took care of the chickens. And in the fall or late summer, we kids hand-picked mustard. We went in the field and picked the mustard, which is a weed, out of the grain. And then the yearly thing that we had for fun was we got a little bit of money from Dad and Grandpa. My granddad lived with us, my father's father. They'd give us a little bit of money, and then we'd go to the county fair. Question 35. Was oil or gas ever a problem to get? How about any other raw materials? Question 35. There we might refer to question 25, which explains that. Yes, gas was hard to get during World War II. A big help we had was that those of us who had chickens, that time feed for the chickens came in printed floral cotton feed sacks. We used these for dresses, blouses, pajamas, aprons, pillowcases, luncheon cloths, quilt tops, whatever. The quilt tops were great because this way we raised sheep. And when Rick would shear them in the spring, if we needed a quilt, we would send 6 pounds of the fleece of wool into the Bemidji woolen mills, and they would send us back a filler for the quilt, which was 3 pounds, because that was 3 pounds of wool. That doesn't sound like much, but wool is light. And then they kept 3 pounds for the cost of cleaning it and carding it. Carding it is making it into a quilt liner. And so there was no cost there. There was just no cost to a quilt, because the feed sacks came with the feed in, and the sheep, the wool came from our sheep. Of course, we could have sold that fleece, but they didn't bring that much. So I had plenty of woolen quilts. Question 36. Do you have any famous people in your family? No, not any have been famous to the outside world. Nor are there any criminals to my knowledge. Through the generations that I have knowledge of, my parents were honest, hard-working people. Mother had a sense of humor. Both were especially attached to their children, had much love for all people. A memory that I have always retained from my father was he used to tell us kids, just remember, the bigger the tree, the harder they fall. He didn't have any sympathy with anyone that had a lot of pride, too much pride. Question 37. What part of your life do you remember most? That took a lot of soul searching, Summer. Because it seems like, well, every part of life has been good, but I believe it would be Rick's and my courtship and our married life. Would be that I remember the most. Okay, going back now or going ahead to 38. Oh, this is cute, where you told me to take a break and get something to drink. Well, we'll go on to 39. Is there anything that I forgot about that you might want to mention? Write that here. These are things that you maybe want and you maybe don't, Summer, but I didn't know where to put the following. But I will add this to use if you want it or not. And I'm beginning here with Well, I do have something else written out here for 39. Well, I think I'll go ahead with this and then I'll get back to 39. Where did we leave off here? Yeah. 39. I think I'll give you this first. Is this right? Okay. This is kind of a split things, Summer, and I don't know if you want to use them or not. But my earliest recollection, and it isn't very much fun telling you what my earliest recollection was because I can't. My brother George is 2 years younger than I am, and he was sitting in a high chair. And I don't know why. I guess I got angry with him and I tipped him over. Imagine that. And then I ran all I was good for. I can't remember, but I hope the folks caught me and gave me a good spanking for it. Another recollection I have, I think George and I must have been about 8 and possibly George was about 6. And we were all out in the hayfield. The folks we kids come along because when the haystack got, they were pitching hay up with a fork, and when they'd have us kids jump on top of the haystack to pack it down, that way it didn't take in water like it did, and besides us kids was with them. This particular day, the folks sent George and I home for something. Now, I can't remember what they sent us home for. Could have been water. I don't know, so I won't even say, because everything I'm relating is only as I truly remember. But I remember us going home, and the thunder clouds were gathering. It was so, it was thundering, and it just come up so fast, and it was so black and awful, and the hayfield was a ways from the house. George and I were both scared, but George had a hold of my hand, and I don't know where I got it from, but I said, George, let's get down on the steps and let's pray. Maybe everything will be all right if we pray. So we did. I don't remember what we said, but I can still see these two little kids sitting with their knees on these steps going into the kitchen praying, and then I remember nothing else except this. I vividly remember I haven't ever been afraid of storms since. After I moved out on the farm, a neighbor lady, she isn't living now, but when the men were in the field, and when storm clouds would come and it would get stormy, she'd come with her little ones over to my place because she was afraid of the storm. I never even paid any attention to it. It was just like, well, so what, you know? And one time she got a little perturbed with me and she says, Mabel, haven't you got sense enough to be scared? I didn't have, but I remembered those two little ones sitting with bent knees on those steps a long time ago. Take it for what you want to. To me, it's very real. It's very much alive in my memory. I used to ride once in a while with my dad down to Wiley. Wiley was a town about, let's see, 4 or 5 miles from where we lived. It was all of that. And anyway, there was, to me now it's just a hill. Then it seemed like a mountain. And it would be the team, and I'd ride by Dad alongside of him on the wagon box. It was usually a wagon he took down there with some grain in. And going down that hill and up again. That was the biggest thrill of my life. Imagine that. For a time, my uncle and aunt and their 2 children, Carl and Lucille, our cousins, lived upstairs in the same house as we lived downstairs. And Carl and I were pretty chummy. George and I thought a lot of each other, but it just seemed like we kind of fought a little bit too. And George was full of tricks. There's one in every family that's full of tricks, and George was the one in our family. And Carl and I would have a makeshift table and chairs, old boxes, and then the dishes we played with when we played house were broken ones that we picked out of the woods. And I'd get the table just set nice, and then George would come along when we weren't looking and he'd kick it over. And then he'd run and laugh. And of course I'd cry, and Carl would talk to me. It was Swedish, but he'd tell me, Gråta icke minni. That meant, don't cry, Mabel. These memories are precious. I was always anxious about school. those days, you could start school at 5 if you tried hard enough. I mean, if you begged hard enough. And that which took the place of kindergarten was 2 weeks in the spring to get familiar with being at school, away from the teacher and all. Well, of course, I just had to start school, and I did. And everything was fine. Dad took me to school with the old Model T, and everything was fine until Dad turned around and started to go home. Then it wasn't so good. But of course, I was going to be a big girl. But that wasn't the only obstacle. The biggest obstacle, and the reason the teacher said that she thought very kindly that maybe I should not come to school till next year, till in the fall, and then during the summer I was to learn English. You see, with my granddad living with us, we talked Swedish, and it was Swedish all the time. There never was an English word, so then of course I had to learn English. The highlights during my school years, my rural school years, was there were spelling contests, and I don't know how to word this so it comes out right, but whatever spelling contest I was in the rural area, the rural schools would get together, I won every one of them. And Carl Mosbeck, and just not long would kid me about how he'd look down at me, and still I was just blessed with good spelling then. And not too long ago, Jack Cruz confronted me at church, and he said, Mabel, you were that little bugger that spelt me down in the spelling contest. Well, it was cold walking to school. At that time, girls just did not wear slacks. They just did not wear overalls, jeans. It just wasn't done. And we walked to school in the cold weather, but we had stockings that were called lisle. They were made of lisle, L-I-S-L-E. They were cotton. And of course, it was better than nothing, but it was cold. But we always made it somehow. Okay, then we'll go on to the thrashing at that time. When I was a kid growing up, it was steam rigs. There was, so that the fellow, Roy Larson, used to be the fellow that would get up real early in the morning and get the outfit going so that there was steam coming, so that's what made the rig run. Mother, there was no refrigeration, of course, and Mother would go to town early in the morning and bring home fresh meat, because the thrashers had breakfast, dinner, and supper, and afternoon lunch, always where they were thrashing. I can't remember which one was a baby at the time that I'm especially thinking of, but Mother would feed the baby, nurse the baby before she went. This was with Tima now, and then she would make a bed for the baby on the Davenport, on a couch, and put chairs in front of the couch so the baby couldn't roll off, and I couldn't handle the baby yet. I was too young to handle the baby. So she said, if the baby cries before you get home, you stick your finger through the railings in the chair, and you make a crook in your little finger and let the baby suck on that till I get home. Well, there were times I got awful tired that time when that baby was little, and I can't remember which one it was. One time during thrashing, I was 12 then, and Mother had myrtle rooks helping her, and I had long braids. My hair was very thick. It was blonde and long braids, and oh, how I wanted a haircut. Oh, my friends around me were getting bobs, is what they called them, so the tip of their ears showed. Well, Myrtle Rook said, I'll cut your hair, but I knew Dad liked my hair long. So, of course, how kids are. I just wanted it so bad, so she cut my hair, and I didn't have any peace until Dad knew that my hair was cut. And he always unloaded grain. This was during thrashing at home, and I went out to the granary, and I stood there till Dad turned around and looked at me, and my heart was clearing up into my throat, and Dad said, oh, you got your hair cut, I see. And then he turned around and started shoveling grain, and nothing more was said. I I can't explain how I felt. I felt bad because I hadn't asked him first, and yet I was glad because he didn't seem to mind that my long braids were gone. At this time, there was another interesting event that kept taking place. There was a fellow who had a store in Hazel, and you that would be listening to this now all know where Hazel is. Hazel is a town off from 59, between the airport road and 59. It's no longer a town, of course. It was just a little one then. And this Matson, I can't remember his first name, but his last name was Matson. He was a cripple. He couldn't use his legs. And he had a fellow drive for him. He made the rounds out in the country selling the groceries, spices and groceries, and of course he always had some candy that somehow found their way into chubby little hands. He gave it to us. And he would, if we didn't have money, he would take eggs or milk or cream and in exchange for what we wanted. I remember those days, and when he used to come down the road, he had a car, but somebody else drove it. This, I think, is kind of interesting yet when I think about the price of mattresses. You know what we used for mattresses? Mother would, well, all the women, they sewed mattresses. Well, I can remember when we had these sacks, there'd be 8 of them, 4 on each side, and they were all sewed to make together, except in the middle on the top 4 sheets that were, 4 of the sheets were sewn for the back, 4 were for the top, but you had to leave an opening midway in the top, and that was filled each fall with clean straw. So each fall, after they thrashed, the mattresses were taken down, the old straw shook out, new straw put in, and then you sat and sewed this opening up. Everybody did it. That's the way it was done. And then go back to my school days. I wanted to teach. Oh, I dreamed of being a teacher. But I also had a lot of trouble with my eyes. In fact, one doctor said I had to have surgery. I had to have it in St. Paul. If I didn't have the surgery, I would lose my eyesight within 6 months. Well, it was a good thing that we didn't have the money for me to have that, because we just went ahead anyway. And I lived without worrying about it, and how much my folks worried, I don't know. But one eye was very crossed, and I still can't see how that could cause blindness, but that's what I was told by a doctor that I guess wanted a little extra money. By going to a doctor in Crookston, he managed to straighten with glasses that eye that was so crossed, and it just worked out just fine. However, at the same time, I was wondering what to do about a career, or I wondered what I was going to do, and that was when I'll get back to that. I'll get over to that. I see where I could have read this before and then put that in somewhere, but anyway, we'll pick up, because when I couldn't teach, I took a course in cosmetology, but I have notes of that further on, which should have been here. I'm sorry. The reason I got this money for cosmetology was because my grandfather, as I said, lived with us, and I was the oldest one in the family, so when the folks went to town, the little kids went along, and I was always the one that would stay with Grandpa because we couldn't leave him alone. Grandpa walked with a cane, and I would stand by the window. I remember one time standing by the window and watching the lights of the car go down the road, and my grandfather spoke up and he said, it was in Swedish, and his nickname for me were Minnie. Ja, du Minnie, which meant, yes, Mabel. You are the one that has to stay and take care of me all the time, but someday you are going to get for it. Well, that didn't mean a single thing to me then, and I'm glad I didn't resent staying with Grandpa. I'm glad I didn't. I don't have that on my conscience because I didn't resent it. I loved him dearly. After he died and funeral expenses were paid, he had left my sister and I each $300. That $300 seen me through beauty school. I went to the Chicago Hairdressing Academy at Fargo, and my course there was $90, and the tools were $10, but I can't remember if that was a part of the $90 or $10 extra. However, that seeing me through by living with my grandparents. For a while, Alice Naplin and I had a room together. I think I'll get to that later on, too. But anyway, for now, the $300 seeing me through beauty school and through getting my state boards. Oh yeah, I've got it down here somewhere. I've got it right underneath. I started this, they called it hairdressing then. That was the term for it then. I started that course in February. And then Alice Naplin, who was a very dear friend of mine, and we were really chummy, she decided to come. And when I first went down there, oh, was I homesick. I would come home from school and I would cry and cry. I was 100 miles from home and so homesick. But I made up my mind I'm not going to be a quitter, and I got to get over my homesickness before Alice comes, because Alice had gone to school in Crookston. She'd gone to the AC, and she'd have been away from home a lot. I figured she wouldn't cry. When Alice got down there, she didn't cry. She howled. But it didn't take too long till we were both just fine. And during the time we went to school, we managed. Alice had borrowed money from her uncle to go. During that time, we went to once in a while we dared to spend a dime, and we went to the theater, movie house, which was called the ISIS Theater in Fargo. And we got to see a show and a comedy for 10 cents. Okay, now we'll go on to when I was married. We were married on June 23rd, 1935. And we lived 3 years in Thief River with Rick farming out in the country, and I was running a beauty shop there. One thing that was kind of interesting I thought about the other day was, now living in Thief River, we had electricity. But people were using ice boxes then. I don't believe refrigerators were out. Or others would have had a refrigerator. We had ice boxes, and O'Hara's delivered chunks of ice. And we got a card that would say 25, 50, whatever. So the amount of ice that we wanted, we put that number so it could be seen from the window. We left our doors open. Why lock them? That wasn't necessary. And the fellow that drove the ice wagon with a team, he used the tongs and put a chunk of ice on his shoulder, came up and put it in our ice box, in the container where that chunk of ice was supposed to be. But you'd better remember at least once a day to check the drip pan. We purchased our farm and moved there October 17th, 1938. Now, going back again to the farm, about some things that I wanted to relate. As you see, they're not really in order, Summer, but that's your problem, huh? Again, back to the farm. When we moved out there in 38, what was different than when I was born and raised on the farm? There is only one thing that I can remember that was different, was that on the farm, the boards and the floor, we scrubbed the floors were white. And you scrubbed them on your hands and knees with the brush. You had to be very careful that you didn't have the water too cold and dirty, because then when the floors dried, they'd be gray instead of white. So and then you look out for splinters, of course. I picked out a lot of them, and everybody else did too, I'm sure. The only difference then, when I moved out, was that we could have, most of the floors were The living rooms would be varnished and the kitchens would be painted. And of course that was a far cry from having to scrub untreated wood. But we still had to carry water in and out, as I before stated, when I was growing up, and there was no electricity. We heated the water on the cook stove that we had to use for anything, and certainly for washing clothes. And our white clothes were always boiled. So we had a boiler on the stove with soap in, and it really boiled those white clothes. We wrung, then when we'd have to use cold water so we could wring them, we'd use a broken old broom handle to lift them up out of the water with. And we put them through 2 cold rinses. And before they got into the boiler, of course, they were washed on a washboard and wrung out by hand. Later, I got a wringer. So, of course, that spared my hands a little bit, the wringing anyway. And the wringer was a dilly that screwed onto the wash tub. It had a handle on it that moved the 2 rollers when you rolled the clothes through it. And that was a big help. And then, of course, with ironing, we had to keep that old wood stove really a-hopping, and we had 3 what was called sad irons on it. I don't know why they called them sad irons, but they had a clamp that would fit down on one, and you'd pick one up and fasten that clamp on it. You pushed a little lever, and that locked this piece of iron in this holder, and you ironed with it until it started getting cold. Of course, everything was ironed, and a lot of things were starched, like dresses and slips and the men's white shirts. And of course they'd be dry after having been starched and so on, and you'd sprinkle them and let the water, let the sprinkles make it damp all over, and iron them with a hot iron. And when one iron got cold, you went and put that back on the stove, and you picked up another one the same way. But later, I don't know how much later, I wished I knew, then a gas iron came out. That was, well, about like the electric irons are now, but this one was bigger, and it had a tank on the back of it that you put white gasoline in, and you had to use a pump, and you pumped it for pressure. So, and let it, and that was great for ironing. The gas lanterns came in at that time, and that was on the same principle. We also had an Aladdin lamp, and when the Aladdin lamp came in, that was with a wick, and it gave a mantle. I mean, it had a mantle, and that made a blue flame. And we had the gas lantern, which was great because the gas lantern was brighter. Okay. I talked about the telephones and party lines. It was still the same way when we moved out on the farm. And then in the spring, now we're still out there without electricity. Grandma Mosbeck, Rick's mother, lived on a farm, and the younger Rick's sisters and brothers lived on a farm approximately 2 miles west of us. Every spring, Rick would butcher 1 beef and 1 pig. The beef, Grandma and I would can. We'd use the boiler and a kettle, a big kettle, and put the quart jars in there filled with beef. That was the meat that we would use during the summer until fall, when it would get cold and it wasn't so hard to keep meat. The pork, that we sliced and fried down in a large 25-gallon crock, and we used the lard that we fried out of this to cover it, and that preserved it. During the summer, we'd go down and pick out what we needed and use that. In the fall, this was in the spring that we did this. In the fall, then I canned the year-old hens. We had hens for laying, and we'd buy pullets every spring. And of course, in the fall, the pullets went in the chicken coop, and the old hens had to go out because naturally Well, they just wouldn't lay as good the second year, so then I'd can what I needed, what I felt we needed during the winter, and the rest of them we sold. About this time, Rick, my husband, and Henry Moline bought a thrashing machine. When they were thrashing in the neighborhood, whenever they thrashed at Oscar's and Mabel's or Henry Moline's or Sam and Irene's or my place, these four ladies would spend one of the days at each place. And when Irene had the thrashers, we'd go over there for maybe the afternoon or the day. I don't remember going more in the afternoon there because Sam didn't farm as much. But at our place, there it was more than a day or two of thrashing. And can you imagine with us taking care of the chores, doing it the hard way, carrying water in and out, wood in, ashes out, and doing the milking and taking care of the chickens, doing all the housework the hard way? We had time to take a day off and spend with each other, and it was fun. Talking about the time, those days we also had the time to go and spend an afternoon with our neighbors. We took our patching along, and it wasn't often, but it certainly was a lot oftener than it is now. All this time I was washing on a board, and this was another revelation that came about. I was wishing that I could have a gas motor. The washing machines then, at this time, had come out, there used to be years ago the kind with a stomper. You've read and heard about them, but that was out of my era. I never had one of them. It was the washboard, which was okay then, and you didn't know any different. But oh, how I wanted a wash machine. The ladies around had them, and I really would like to have had one because the rugs in the men's underwear really got to be a little hefty on the board and wringing out and all. So then Burge Marine was a fellow that met a very sad death by freezing to death down by Dorothy, and in the spring there was an auction sale, and Rick went to that, and he came home with a washing machine goodbye to the washboards. And of course we had to have rinse tubs, but of course my big worry was those clothes won't get clean. I just know that they are not going to get clean like when I rub them on the board. But I thought, well, jeepers, my neighbors, they look all right, and they've got them, and their clothes look all right, but I did many washings with the feeling that they weren't going to get clean. Okay. Then, what did we do for refrigeration with the milk and the butter and the meat and this? And we had crockery that we would put perishables in, like butter, if we happened to have fresh meat, which wasn't too likely in the summertime because we used the canned, and we could only have a small amount of fresh meat. So we'd be sure to get it used up before it did spoil. But we'd hang this in containers, in watertight containers in the well, the milk. So each time before a meal, we'd have to go out and bring in the milk and the butter and anything that was perishable that we wanted for the meal. And as soon as the meal was completed, it was to carry it out again. In the early years on the farm, Rick and I had horses, cattle, pigs, sheep, and chickens, with a good-sized garden, and with canning from the garden and the berries from the woods, which were cranberries, juneberries, chokecherries, pincherries, plums. We had a crabapple tree that had been planted on the farm that we bought, and we could make. Now, from these fruits that we had in the woods, we made our sauce and our jam and jellies. We lived off the land as the neighbors did. I wish I could remember when I bought the first store cookie and bread. It would be interesting. Our grocery lists usually were flour, sugar, coffee, yeast, kerosene for the lamps, a book of matches once in a while. And this we purchased at Dorothy. Dorothy was a little town just about 5 miles from us, sort of on the way to Crookston. And there was a general merchandise store run by Alfred Hans. And when I say general merchandise, I mean general merchandise. It was everything in there. We could get twine for the binder. We could get canvas if the old one couldn't be patched anymore, and just general merchandise. And we would I'd take with me, or Fred went, the eggs and the milk and the cream, and that was in exchange for what we were buying. He bought that from us, and we bought his products from him. And once in a while, maybe it wouldn't be quite enough to reach for what we had to buy, if it was some repairs or so for the outside. In the fall, after thrashing, Rick would go down. He'd say, "Well, Fritz," that was his nickname, "what do I owe you?" And they would settle up, and thus it went on. Okay, then we're still on question number 39, still on that. And this should maybe have been when I mentioned cosmetology before, but I was sort of relating it according to the years, like the other things I talked about from youth, and then from children, and then youth, and then later adults. I told you about taking the course at Fargo, which I have repetition here. My examination I took in North Dakota and acquired a North Dakota license, and then I could manage a shop because North Dakota didn't have the law that you had to work a year under a manager in order to get your manager's license. You got it right away. So I started a shop in Pembina. I didn't stay there too long because when it rained, the town folded up. I tried Drayton, that was the same thing. But then I changed my license from the North Dakota license. There was reciprocity between North Dakota and Minnesota. So I gave up my North Dakota license in exchange for a Minnesota license. And I worked at Halleck and Thief River Falls then for a lady by the name of Karen Hobby. She had a shop at Halleck and later moved it to Thief River Falls. And then later on I had my own shop in Thief River Falls in partnership with Bernice Anderson. I sold the shop after our son was born in 1941. Our son died 8 months later. On December 19th, this was a memorable time, on December 19th, 1948, the electricity was turned on in part of the house. It wasn't all wired yet, but they'd wired it enough so that we could have, there was electricity in a part of the house. And I remember how excited I was because the Mosbecks got together for an annual Christmas day. On Christmas Day, we got together for an annual party at Grandma's house, and we'd draw names. And it was either George or Grace that got Rick's or my name, and they gave us a little lamp. And I could hardly wait to get home to plug it into the electricity. Then later on, we got a small electric radio, we got our electric refrigerator, and an electric iron. We paid, as we bought things, we tried not to buy anything that we couldn't pay for in relationship to the house, because Rick always said, well, you know, we had to be aware of that which we needed for a living. And he always believed in comfort, and he didn't care about style, but he wanted us to be comfortable. Okay, for a while there was only water to the barn and to the chicken coop, but that was great because then I didn't have to carry water to the chicks. And then later on, the water come up to the house. That was great. May 10th of 1956, we bought our water heater. And with it, if we bought that certain month, we got a free General Electric frying pan. You know what the cost of this water heater was? $99. Do you want to know how long it lasted? It's still in use. but it's kind of on its way out now. Steve says he's going to have to replace it, but it heats up to a point. Our bathroom was put in, and oh, that was great, on the 23rd of June, 1958. And that was our 23rd wedding anniversary. And at that time, Rick and I would go to Roy Lake like for overnight, just because that was our way of celebrating our anniversary. And this particular Saturday, which was when the bathroom, Butch and my nephew was working for us, and Rick finished putting it in, and we had baths, and we went to the lake, and every once in a while Rick would say, "Ma, you know something? We got a bathroom at home." Oh, it was fun times. In January of 1946, 20-month-old Karen came into our lives, and Phyllis, her sister, came for summers for a time after 46, and she came to stay with us in 1950. Both girls are adopted. Now I have 6 grandchildren. I have had 6 grandchildren. One is deceased. And 3 great-grandchildren. And I have a few others that call me Grandma, and they couldn't treat me any better if I were their real Grandma. Through the married years, Rick and I both served on church committees. I served in the Association for Retarded Children, and also on the church council. I served on the church council, but before we went LCA and were Augustana, there were missionary societies, and I served on that and the Association for Retarded Children on local, district, and state levels. I served on the welfare board also. I've served on government advisory board and the Northwest Regional for developmental disabilities. This was a kind of an offspring from the Association for Retarded Children. I served on those committees. I would like to tell you about, as a continuation of this 39, we got our first combine about 1951, and our first hay bale, or the only hay baler I guess we had, about 1954. And these two things brought about, well, it made work much easier with the combine and faster, and also with the baler. In 1969 we had an experience that was so many times with anxiety can also come heartwarming blessings, it seems like. On June 23rd, ironic that it was the 23rd of June, our wedding anniversary, in 1969 Rick underwent surgery for an abdominal aneurysm. At this time, aneurysms were considered far more serious than they are today. However, if an aneurysm breaks, it's just as serious today as it was in 69. But Rick came through it. It took him quite a while for recovery, but he came through it just fine. It was in June. So naturally, by the time we got home from Rochester, and pretty soon it was combining time. And the doctor did not want Rick out on the tractor. He wasn't or the combine. He wasn't strong enough for it. But he'd been over to the neighbors one day, and he came home at noon. And at noon the phone rang, and Raymond Moline, my neighbor, said, "Mabel, how are you stocked on baked goods?" And I thought, well, that's kind of a funny question, but I said, well, yeah, I've got some bread and I've got some cookies and etc. And I said, why? Well, she says, hasn't Rick come home yet? And I said, yeah, he's home. And she said, they're coming over to take off your crop. And that's exactly what they did. Right offhand, I should have looked this up, but the entire neighborhood came over. Some of them had just put their combines away because they'd taken off their own crops, and they came over in the afternoon, and they took off all the crop and hauled it into the granaries from the home farm and the hybrid farm that we were renting. The ladies came with food. for the afternoon, and some of them went home, and one of my dear friends, Gladys Hallstrom, dashed in and bought some meat, and they gave them supper. So at 10:30 that night, they were just finishing up. The last trucks were coming in with grain, had emptied the grain, and it was quite a thing. That's the way that neighborhood is. It was great. Then Rick this was in 69, and Rick lived until 77, and he passed away August 13th. I continued to stay on the farm, and then I kind of decided that, well, I think I should be doing something else more than just taking part in church activities, which I don't mean that just, but taking part in church activities, and I just needed some more of a goal. So I was going to start looking for a job. And then Dale Dillon, who I'd worked for before part-time, asked me if I would come back, which I did. And I think I worked for Dale until 82. Then I decided that the winter driving, well, this was just part-time, just Saturdays when he needed me. But it seemed like if it was going to storm, it would storm on Friday night or Saturday. But I enjoyed working for Dale, and I got to be very close to Dale and Jan and their family. And their family treats me like a grandma. So I've been one very lucky person. In April 1992, I sold my farm to my grandson, Stephen. I'm really pleased about this because it'll remain in the family, and he tells me I can come out there anytime I want to and browse around, and I'm invited out for meals once in a while, and it's just fine. I moved to Thief River then in April of 1992, and it's kind of taken me a couple of years to adjust, maybe a little less, but I'm very happy here. And I have decided that this is the place to be at this time of my life. I would like to divide my life into 3 parts. Childhood and or growing up, number 1. The middle years, number 2. The sunset years, which I am in now, number 3. And the sunset years are good. Each phase of life has been good. Some thorns, yes, but the roses smell so sweet. Anything I have written has not been a complaint or to boast. What I have related to you is as I know it as I knew it at that time and remembered. I have related it to the best of my ability, with no intention of adding to or to detract from it. My thanks to Edgar Naplin, who verified some portions I wasn't quite sure of. That's it. The kick out of that aren't in all the other literature that I sent for you to go through. But one thing, when we were kids, we slept 4 in a bed. The 2 girls at the head and the 2 boys at the feet. I was always more tired than the rest because I was the oldest, of course, and had the most work to do. So I would tell the kids, let's see who could be quiet the longest. And they fell for that, so of course then it got quiet and I could go to sleep. Another thing I wanted to tell you about is Mom was against my reading. I read in bed so much. I still do at my age, 93. And she would doubt if I had put the light out. So there was a register in the bedroom that we girls slept in upstairs, and I'd stuff a pillow in the register so she couldn't see the light. Talk about a meanie, huh? Oh, I have to tell you this. Gus Chileen was married to Dad's sister Clara, and they lived with us for a while. And Grandpa Lindbloom told me that any eggs that I could find that weren't in the chicken coop, her hens were outside all the time then, you know, I could have a certain amount for each egg. I think it was a penny an egg or whatever it was. Well, Gus Chileen was kind of a meanie, and he'd take the eggs and he'd break them and suck them out the inside so I wouldn't get the egg. And one time, I didn't do it intentionally, but I come across a nest and I guess the eggs were rotten. And did he get mad? Oh, and he was really going to give it to me, and Grandpa Lindbloom got after him and he said, oh no, you don't. You don't get after her for that because you had no business breaking the eggs and sucking them out so she don't get money for them. Good enough for you, don't you touch her. And of course he didn't either. When I was 16, I cooked for Ed Marine. And of course then everything was baked. I washed and cleaned and cooked for Ed, his father, and 2 hired men. The women took turns taking the cream to St. Hilaire with John Steiger's every 2 weeks. So every 2 weeks I drove in with John Steiger's cream and Ed Marine's cream in the morning on Monday morning. Later on, I took a course in beauty culture. I've told you that in the other write-up. But I worked for a woman, I won't say her last name, but her first name was Karen in Halleck. The second day I worked for her, I don't believe in fortune tellers, and I don't believe in Friday the 13th being bad, and I don't believe in other words, I don't believe in any of that stuff. But this is kind of comical, because the second day there was a fortune teller that came around, the second day that I was in Halleck. And she said to me, Karen said, why don't you have your fortune told? So we were in a separate room, you know. Karen had hers told first, and then I had mine told. And I don't remember all of it. I had a slip on it, but I don't know what happened to it through the years, but I remember some of it. And she told me that I was going with someone where the wheels were going real fast. But the man I was in love with was Rick, and she wrote R-I-C on a piece of paper. She said, that's not his real name, but it's what I called him. She said I would have 3 children. The vision was blurry of one, so I imagine that was Richard Jr., who died as a baby. And going back to the wheels going fast, I think I'll come to that after a while, but I was going with a fellow, I went with a fellow by the name of Early Glenn, and he was a bootlegger, but I think I'll come to that later on. The other thing I have to tell you about when we were in Halleck was Karen was kind of a, I don't know, ladies' man. She came home from having coffee over at the one afternoon when we weren't busy, and she said, oh, Mabel, she said, I couldn't get out of it. She said, I had to promise this fellow that I'd go with him tonight. So, but she said, when he comes to the door, I'm going to hide, and you tell him that my husband came and that I went with him. So, okay, a knock came at the door later on, and Karen beats it in the other room, and I went to the door, and I said to this man, he said, is Karen here? And I said, no, her husband came, and she went with him. Oh, he said, and he shut the door and went. And across the street was a garage, and he drove into the garage, and of course this room was dark. And Karen came running out, and she said, oh, she said, that sounds like my husband. She said, that's Theodore. She said, oh my God, she said. So of course, this is what happened. I had stood and told her husband that her husband had come and taken her, thinking it was the other guy. I was only doing as I was told. But it was a funny thing. I don't know what she ever told him, but he was polite to me, but he'd never carry on a conversation, and I don't know how she talked herself out of it. I don't know what she did. Anyway, we moved to Thief River then, and I worked for Karen for about 1.5 years, and the Minnesota law is that you work as an operator for 1 year, and then you get that manager-operator to sign a piece of paper that you have worked for her 1 year, then you can get a manager's license. And I thought, well, I might just as well get my manager's license. Well, when she would go to her home in, where did they live? Roosevelt? Oh, some town up north. I can't think of it right now. I should have had it down here, but I didn't. Anyway, she would come home on on Thursday night, and then I'd wash and set her hair, and she'd pick up the money that I had made during the week, or if I had help, money from two of us or whatever, and take care of the business, and then she'd go back to where she lived, and she didn't come back again then until the next Thursday. This Thursday, in the meantime, my manager's license had come, and I thought to myself, I was a little scared putting it up all right, but I put it up by the shampoo stall, and she seen it. She says, "You got your manager's license, huh?" And she says, "How did you get it?" And I said, "You know, Karen, I have never, ever not answered you correctly on anything you've asked me, but this is one thing I cannot answer you on. It doesn't matter how I got it, but I got it." And but she wouldn't sign for me. She went up. We had a real honest lawyer by the name of H.O. Burvey. Boy, he was so honest that, and I went up to him not knowing she'd been there. And he said, "I can't do anything for you, Mabel," he said, "because she's been here. And all I can tell you is don't sign that slip of paper." Well, she had been up to him with a slip of paper that she would sign for me so I could get my manager's license. But then in turn, I had to sign a slip of paper that I would always work 100 miles from where she was. If I wasn't working for her, I'd have to be 100 miles from her. So I didn't say anything. I went back to the shop, and on the way back to the shop, I thought to myself, well, it never hurts to be honest, does it? That was the only recourse I had, was to be honest. So I wrote to the state board, and I told them like it was. And they wrote back, and they told me if I could get the signatures of 2 people who were neighbors who had seen me come to work for at least a year, they would accept those signatures, and they would send me my license with the $10 that I sent for getting it. Well, of course, you know, those days, everybody was one big family, and the beauty shop was right next door to Ed O'Hara that had the coal and fuel bit. And across the street from the Rex Cafe where Phil was, and Dr. Newell was on that aisle, and the 2 barbers in the front end of the shop, you know. And everybody wanted to sign for me. And I said, "I appreciate you guys wanting to sign for me, but I can't have more than 2. Well, I got 2 signatures and sent it in, and that's how I got my license. Well, of course, when she got angry about that I got my license and I wouldn't tell her who had signed for me, she said, "You don't need to tell me." She said, "I wrote to the state board and they told me." And I didn't answer her, but I could have said, "Well, then why ask me in the first place?" But I said, "Well, I can understand, Karen, that our working relationship won't be too good. I'll put in my notice for 2 weeks so that you can get somebody else." "Oh, you can go right away," she said. "I can get a good girl in. I can get a good girl in an hour." So I finished her hair, and I went, and we lived in the back of the shop to save expenses, you know, for sleeping and eating. And so we lived back there, and Rick and I were going together, and I called him and told him about what had happened. So he pretended like he didn't know it, and he came to the back door, and she threw her arms around him, and she said, "Mabel walked out on me, and she didn't give me any notice," and all this and that. Well, Rick knew better, you know. But anyway, that takes care of that. Rick and I were in love. Yeah, we were. And I made up my mind. I tried to forget Rick, because with his responsibilities, when could we ever marry? So I started going with this Ernie, and he's the fellow where the wheels went so fast, because he, well, I better go back and say, this is one thing I can honestly say before God, that I'm glad I didn't resent his father's wishes, and that was that Rick seen to that the younger ones got brought up all right. And I never resented the fact that we couldn't get married, because we had to wait till they were grown up. And I'm so glad that God gave me the strength that I didn't resent them. because I can honestly say I didn't. Okay, Ernie was a bootlegger, so it was no wonder that he drove a nice car. He always had money. But one night we were out riding, and he turned the lights off, and he drove so fast in the dark that I was really scared. And that, of course, I went back to thinking about that fortune teller saying that I would be going with somebody where the wheels went real fast. Well, the wheels went fast, all right. He finally got caught. When I was 16, Rick and I were dancing to Let Me Call You Sweetheart. He told me he couldn't understand his feelings, but he thought he loved me. I knew I loved him. I might add here, the last week he lived, he thanked me for the years of happiness I'd given him. My answer was, you know, Rick, you haven't given me nearly as much happiness. I haven't given you nearly as much happiness as you have given me. But I didn't dare to carry on the conversation because at Mayo they told two things to avoid for the good of his health, and that was excitement and exertion. But I did get a chance to answer him that he had given me more happiness than I'd given him. But you know, that's a wonderful thing for a widow to have. Not every widow can go with that her husband thanked her because he had given him happiness. And I failed him in so many ways, like I failed everybody else. But God is good. Okay, another highlight of life was when Phyllis called me mother the first time. We adopted the two girls, and that's in my other literature that I have sent you about that. But the big thrill was the first time Phyllis called me mother. I'll never forget it. Another one, when my niece Armstrong composed, in her own words, a poem she sent me entitled, What is a Special Aunt? How unworthy I am of it, yet it has spurred me on when I have felt real low. I'm sorry, Carrie, go. Okay. I have had every experience one can have in a lifetime, including a family, Kim Lindbloom, who committed suicide. He was schizophrenic and bipolar and couldn't get help. He was to the third floor and asked for help, and they told him he didn't need it, so he went home and bought a gun, and that was it. That took care of the suicide in our family. Okay, then it seemed like there was just one thing left to experience during life, and that was murder. Kyra, who was my grandson Ray Mosbeck's stepdaughter, was murdered in Mississippi by a fellow who knew her real well, but he wasn't her fiancé or anything, but she was engaged to be married, and he couldn't have her, so he didn't want anybody else to have her. I've talked a lot to Marilyn about nudges and other good friends, and you know, it seems like every once in a while God has nudged me to do something, and I thought to myself, God, I don't want to do that. That don't make sense. But you know, every time I don't do it, I'm sorry for it. God has been so good to me. Nothing is as important as seeking God's will and letting Him rule in our lives. If we Matthew 5:36, seek ye first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things shall be added to you. I can't think of any more things right now, Carrie Jo, but I wanted to add that much to what the other literature I'm already sending you. You know that I love you and your whole family, and that's it, my dear. Bye-bye. There now. Oh, Carrie, I just remembered. Donald reminded me of a true story about Grandpa Lindbloom, and I think that's kind of interesting. And I'm reading it from the paper where it says, a true story at the top of it. An interesting story of mill days goes like this. Charlie and Ole Brink, the latter being a father of Albert Brink, had an implement and blacksmith shop in St. Clair. Mr. Lindbloom, that's Pete, my granddad, a large and husky man from west of town, came into their place of business and wanted to buy a wagon box.
He looked at the wagon box and said he didn't think it was worth much. Mr. Brink said, if you can carry that wagon box a mile, I'll give it to you. Mr. Lindbloom put the wagon box on his back and started towards Red Lake Falls. After carrying it a half a mile, he met Dr. Lamole. Lamole, I think it's pronounced. Mr. Lindbloom inquired, how far is it to Red Lake Falls? Dr. Lamole retorted, are you crazy? Mr. Lindbloom's followers were afraid he might try to carry the box to Red Lake Falls. So Mr. Brink said, if you carry it back to St. Clair, you can have the box. Mr. Lindbloom did so, and the box became his. You know, for many years, Carrie Jo, the end gate to that wagon box laid on the farm at home. The wagon box was all worn out. And, oh, I'm so sorry I didn't keep it. I don't know why I didn't, but, you know, I didn't. You know, when you're young, you don't think about those things. Okay, I'd like to read to you what the commodity prices were at that time, because here are some things that will really surprise you. Calico per yard. Calico is a cloth, in case you don't know what it means. It's yardage. That was 5 or 6 cents a yard. Gingham was 5 or 6 cents a yard. Arbuckle and McLaughlin coffee, 5 pounds for $1. Just imagine. Butter per pound, 10 cents. Eggs per dozen, 45 cents. Wheat per bushel was 45. No, eggs per dozen was 6 or 7 cents, and wheat per bushel was 45 cents. Oats per bushel was 13 cents, and corn per bushel was 20 cents. Just imagine that. And in the earlier report that I have, that I wrote out for that I gave for Summer Day, there it tells, and that's fitting to bring it in here. I think during the Depression, when times were so hard, Henry Carpenter wanted a job so bad, and he asked Rick if he couldn't hire him, and Rick said, you know, Hank, I need help so bad, he said, and I'd like to hire you, but he said, I can't afford to. He said, I just absolutely can't. And well, Henry said, what could you afford to give me? And Rick jokingly said, oh, I suppose about 15 cents an hour. Well, I'll take it, Henry said. So he worked for 15 cents an hour. Imagine that. And then look what people are getting now. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? And in the other report that I have, I think one place it tells, Edgar told me about how they worked for 45 cents an hour during thrashing time, but I don't have it with me right now, but it's in the other report I gave you. You can look it up. But I just thought I'd add that. Oh yes, and then I wanted to add too about berry picking time. I think, as I said before, we didn't buy anything to can because, well, we just didn't. There wasn't money for it, and we didn't buy it. But we got it out of the woods. And Elma and Hattie and Mabel and Mother and I, we used to go in the woods and pick berries. And Hybrids Woods was big. We were renting Hybrids, so we felt we had authority to go there. And because Rick was renting it, and there we picked pin cherries, we picked plums, we picked choke cherries and cranberries and June berries and some strawberries. But now I've many times thought it would be fun to go up in the old home place and go up there and look in the woods. But you see, the spraying for them, when they sprayed for the mustard in the fields by aerial spraying, it killed a lot of that stuff. So it's gone now, but I tell you, nothing went into the basement unless it was that we paid for, that's for sure. It was what we worked for. Got it out of the woods or grew it. Just had to add that, Carrie Jo. I imagine there are other things too. Mother, well, I think I said that in the other report about Mother working hard, and she picked chickens, and she picked chickens for a living, and she had the 3 kids after Reuben died. So it was kind of tough for her, but she always kept her good humor. She always was good-natured and full of fun and all that kind of thing. I guess that's all I can think of right now, anyway.
Nikolina. Here is a sample of the music that was popular with the Swedes in the early 20s. Mabel thought it would be good to add this. Some of the more strict Swedes thought it was too worldly, but Agnes could sing Nikolina perfectly. The song Nikolina was made popular by Hjalmar Peterson, who was a Swede from Lancaster, Minnesota. He had a band and performed all over the Midwest, Chicago, and some in New York. His stage name was Ole I Skrattholt, which literally means Ole in Laughtersville. His performances included stand-up jokes, funny songs, and funny stories. Martin Mosbeck could do a pretty good impression of Ole because Martin loved to sing. I also heard George do a few bars of Nikolina, and it sounded good. And here's Nikolina with, or Ole Skrattholt with Nikolina. And I'll translate the song to English at the end.
Att vara kär, det är en ryslig pina. Den som försökte säger inte nej. Jag var så rysligt kär i Nikolina, och Nikolina lika kär i mig. Om hennes hand jag bad hos hennes pappa, men fick ett svar som jag ej väntat på. Jag har aldrig kommit ut för någon trappa så rysligt hastigt som jag gjorde då. Då gick jag hem och skrev till Nikolina om hon ville vara så rysligt snäll och möta mig när månen börjar skina i Ikebacken nästa lördagskväll. Där mötte mig en mörk figur i kappa och månen sken på himmelen den blå. Den mötande var Nikolinas pappa, beväpnad med en rätt förfarlig påk. Jag blev så rädd, jag darrade i knäna och tog till bina både rädd och skygg. Men som jag smög där fram emellan träna lät gubben påken dansa på min rygg. Då gick jag hem och skrev till Nikolina: nu är den med mitt hela liv adjö. Om du ej bota kan min kärlek tina, går jag och dränker mig i närmsta sjö. Men Nikolina botade min sjuka. Hon sa: det kära Olle, tänk dig för. Den som sitt liv förkortar en kruka. Du kan väl lugna dig tills gubben dör. Och nu så väntar jag och Nikolina att gubben han ska kola vippen av och till ett minne efter honom sätter den gamla tågen upp på gubbens grav.
Here's what the story means. When you're in love, you're in an awful torture. Whoever's tried it will not disagree. I was so very fond of Nikolina, and Nikolina just as fond of me. I asked her father for her hand in marriage and got the answer in the strangest way. I never yet got out on any doorstep in such a hurry as I did that. I went home and wrote to Nikolina. "Oh, Nikolina, won't you see me soon? Please meet me in the woods on Wednesday evening, and be there with the rising of the moon." And there I met a figure all disconcerting. The moon no greater glory could attain. The one I met was Nikolina's papa, armed with the meanest, most disturbing cane. And then my knees, how they began to tremble. I tried to run, but did not have a chance. For in the woods, as on my knees I stumbled, the cane began to do a polka dance. Then I went home and wrote to Nikolina, "There's not the slightest hope for me. If you don't end me with this awful torture, I'll end it all by jumping in the sea." And then Nikolina answered in a hurry, "Oh, darling Carl, don't be so unwise. A suicide is nothing but for a dumbbell. Why don't we wait until the old man dies?" And so I wait, and so does Nikolina, to see the old man kick the bucket soon. And on his grave we're planting in remembrance the cane he used upon me beneath the moon. Nikolina.